Footage circulating online captures something that rarely makes it onto open source channels: an underground missile storage complex being destroyed from the inside. The target is Isfahan, Iran. The weapon responsible is the GBU-72, a 5,000-pound hardened penetrator delivered from an F-15E Strike Eagle, one of the most capable deep strike munitions in the entire United States military arsenal. What the footage shows, and what it means for the broader conflict, deserves a careful breakdown. When a pressurized underground facility is struck by a weapon of this kind, the detonation has nowhere to go. Blast energy channels through tunnel corridors, through connected chambers, through every passage that Iran's engineers spent decades hollowing into those mountains south of Isfahan. Then it vents. The secondary explosions visible in the footage, the ones that make it look as though the mountain itself is answering back, are not aftershocks. They are individual sections of that underground complex being destroyed in sequence, one after another, as the pressure wave finds each new space and consumes it. Iran spent roughly 4 decades engineering these facilities to survive conventional air campaigns. The mountains south of Isfahan are not just convenient geography, they are deliberate architecture, reinforced with concrete, buried to depths that standard precision-guided munitions could not reliably reach, their entrance tunnels blended into the terrain to appear unremarkable from satellite imagery. For a long time, that design worked exactly as intended. Strikes would damage surface infrastructure, collapse entrance points, and yet the missiles stored deep inside would survive. The following morning, launches would continue. That recurring problem is precisely what the GBU-72 was built to solve. The weapon made its combat debut earlier in this conflict, initially deployed along the Strait of Hormuz coastline to destroy underground drone and missile storage facilities. It performed as designed. Its arrival at Isfahan represents an escalation in targeting priority. Isfahan is not a peripheral site. It is the heart of Iran's ballistic missile production ecosystem. What separates the GBU-72 from its predecessors is not size alone. The critical engineering achievement is the fuse. Previous penetrators faced a fundamental physical problem. The fuse had to survive the entire penetration sequence, punching through reinforced concrete, through compacted earth, through rock, before detonating. That survival requirement created limits on how deep a weapon could reliably function. The GBU-72's fuse is hardened to endure that full sequence, detonating only once the weapon has reached the depth where Iran's engineers believed physics itself provided protection. That fuse survivability is the defining technological breakthrough of this platform. The weapon also carries a dual guidance system. A pilot can pre-program GPS coordinates before takeoff and release from a safe standoff distance with a single control input. Alternatively, the weapons systems officer in the F-15E's rear seat can update targeting coordinates in real time during the attack run. If the targeting pod's laser track is broken, by a hard maneuver, by countermeasures, by any disruption, the weapon locks onto the last confirmed laser point and converts it to a GPS coordinate. The target is not lost. The system adapts mid-flight. Some observers watching this campaign have noted that close to 20 separate bunker buster strikes have been conducted against the Isfahan complex area over recent months, involving B-2 Spirits, B-52s, and earlier F-15E strikes with GBU-57 munitions, and yet missiles continued to launch from those same mountains the following mornings. The explanation is depth and redundancy. Iran's facilities were not designed with a single entrance and a single storage chamber. Multiple exit tunnels were built precisely so that if one was collapsed, crews could route missiles out through another and continue operations. The GBU-57, the previous generation penetrator, was highly effective against a wide range of hardened targets, but against the deepest sections of a facility of this scale, there were physical limits to how far it could reach before detonating. The GBU-72 extends that limit significantly, and when it detonates at the correct depth inside an interconnected tunnel network, the result is not a localized collapse. It is a cascading destruction sequence that propagates through every connected space. The choice of delivery platform also matters for understanding the operational tempo of this campaign. A B-2 mission from Missouri is a global power projection statement. It requires extensive coordination, hours of transit, and significant logistical overhead. An F-15E strike with a GBU-72 from a regional base is a fundamentally different kind of option. A two-ship formation, a 30 to 45-minute flight, weapons on target, and recovery. That speed and operational flexibility changes how commanders can use this capability. It is not a weapon reserved for singular, high-visibility strikes. It can be employed repeatedly as intelligence identifies new targets, at a pace and a frequency that a strategic bomber mission cannot match. While these strikes were being processed internationally, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to all vessel traffic. Hours after that declaration, Iranian forces fired on a tanker operating in darkness. 2 Iranian attack drones were neutralized through coordinated U.S. Navy and Air Force response. The tanker completed its transit. Hundreds of commercial vessels are currently moving through the strait along coordinated safe corridors that U.S. Central Command has established and is actively defending. The gap between what Iran declared and what Iran is currently capable of enforcing is one of the most significant strategic data points of this entire conflict. What is happening inside Iranian leadership during this period requires careful reading. Iran does not operate a unified command structure in the way a Western military does. The Supreme Leader's Office, the IRGC Command, the formal government and presidency, and various internal factions within each of those entities hold different and sometimes directly opposing views on how this conflict should end. When statements emerge from one level of Iranian leadership indicating that a deal has been reached, and officials at another level publicly deny that any agreement was signed, those two claims can both be accurate simultaneously. That is the fracture point. Some factions are looking for an exit from this conflict. Others believe continued resistance is the only acceptable path. The GBU-72 strikes are landing directly into that internal debate. Every successful strike against a ballistic missile facility does 2 things simultaneously. It degrades the physical capability that Iran would use to enforce any future deterrence posture against Israel, against U.S. regional bases, against Gulf state infrastructure, against commercial shipping, and it shifts the internal argument inside Tehran toward the factions arguing that this conflict needs to end before the losses become irreversible. Iran's ballistic missiles are not merely weapons. They are the foundation of Iran's regional deterrence architecture, the mechanism by which Iran signals that it can impose costs on any actor threatening its survival. If that stockpile is being systematically reduced, the factions whose political position depends on that deterrent lose leverage, not just militarily, but internally. Continued strikes during active negotiations are not incompatible with reaching a deal. They are a method of shaping the terms of one. Iran's core negotiating priorities, based on reporting from diplomatic channels, center on financial relief to rebuild damaged infrastructure, preservation of as much of their ballistic missile program as possible, and keeping specific stockpile numbers out of any written agreement. That last point is strategically significant. The moment a verified missile count appears in a signed agreement, that number becomes both a ceiling and a verification target. Keeping it ambiguous preserves future optionality. The United States' position centers on uranium enrichment constraints, missile program limitations, and a formal commitment to the free flow of commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is not merely a diplomatic talking point. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply transits through it. When Iran declares the strait closed, global insurance premiums for tanker operations spike immediately. Shipping companies begin calculating alternative routes around Africa, adding weeks and significant operating costs to every voyage. The current U.S. safe corridor system is containing that economic impact, but it requires continuous active military presence to maintain. Every drone Iran launches at a tanker, even drones that are intercepted, sends a signal to the shipping market that the risk premium has not returned to zero. That signal has a measurable economic cost, and it is distributed across every nation dependent on that oil supply. Iran is estimated to have held between 10,000 and 15,000 ballistic missiles across various range categories before this conflict escalated. That stockpile was sized specifically to overwhelm regional missile defense systems through volume alone. Reducing it, not to zero, but to a threshold where saturation attacks become logistically and operationally difficult, changes the military calculus for every potential target in the region. Deterrence does not require elimination. It requires creating a condition where Iran's commanders must make deliberate choices about what they are willing to expend and what they hold in reserve. That is the threshold this campaign is working toward. 3 realistic paths forward are visible in the current open-source record. The first is a negotiated agreement in the near term, contingent on the internal factions within Iran, favoring an exit gaining sufficient leverage over those opposing one, and on both sides reaching workable terms on enrichment, missile constraints, and the strait. The second is a continuation of strikes without a signed deal, with Iran managing the conflict at a reduced intensity, launching enough to signal resistance without crossing the threshold that would threaten regime survival. This path is the most costly over time for regional stability and global markets. The third path, favored by the hardline factions within Iran's leadership, is a decision to escalate significantly, betting that the cumulative costs imposed on the United States and its partners will eventually exceed political will to sustain the campaign. The GBU-72 strikes are specifically designed to make that third option progressively less viable. If the missile stockpile underpinning the escalation bet is being reduced, the bet becomes harder to make and harder to sustain with each passing strike.